When Starmer came in England in 2024, how many people across the entire British state changed jobs? 200. 100 ministers, most of whom are MPs as well, and 100 special advisors, of which I was one, who constitutionally aren't allowed to tell civil servants what to do and have no power. It's almost impossible to get fired. I think a study came out a few weeks ago in England that said that you're more likely to die in the job than to be fired in the civil service. And I was the one person in that room, because obviously I'm the only political person in there and the rest are all civil servants. So, but what about their freedom? Right? What about their personal experience? And you'd assume that I'd called their mum a whore or something, right?
This episode of the Free Cities podcast is brought to you by Veritas Villages. Now, Veritas Villages are freedom-oriented, energy self-sufficient luxury communities designed for people who want to enjoy peace of mind and real freedom in today's unpredictable world. Join a community of like-minded neighbours who value privacy and independence in a place where you can use Bitcoin, including for the purchase of your property. www.veritasvillages.com/free cities for more info, and in the meantime, enjoy the conversation. What I really wanted to talk about, because you have a lot of experience as an advisor to governments, rather than sort of focus in on what's happening in the UK, because I think it's fair to say that what's happening in the UK is something that's happening in a lot of places, roughly speaking, a lot of places we care about anyway. I'd quite like to just kind of pull out a little bit, and I was thinking just before you came in there, it's quite a macro view of this whole thing, but I'd quite like to know what you think in three things: what you think the problem is, why is it, and how do we fix it from your perspective, and then we'll see where it goes from there.
And by problem, we're talking
what everyone can feel right now. I don't know whether that is just me. I don't think it's just me. I mean, I was surprised, listening to everyone this morning, the questions, and the general sentiment was, there's a big problem. And I don't necessarily mean just about conservatism. I just mean about government and governing and government. And since you've been on the inside, I'd love to know, first of all, what is the major problem? What is it that's why everyone feels so despondent at the moment?
Yeah, okay. So I think that the explosion since the Industrial Revolution of technological change means that you can experience all these wonders of lifestyle increases and all the rest of it. Then you get the feeling that, something must be done to help out other people. And so all this stuff builds up into the kind of creation of a welfare state in around the same places at the same time, alongside a kind of concomitant philosophical set of opinions that I guess kind of comes from people like Rousseau and like Francis Bacon maybe, and these sorts of early people who were not necessarily rationalists themselves but are precursors of that. And Michael Oakeshott's got the great Rationalism in Politics essay that people should read to get the early strains of this, which is something that Adam Smith calls the man of system. And someone who sort of thinks that he can order the world like the pieces of a chessboard without realising that the pieces themselves have their own viewpoints. So there's a sort of philosophical siding to this, that you can try and order the world and understand it, that goes along with that scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and then the Industrial Revolution with the material consequences. Marx came along, thought all these things were terrible and bourgeois and all the rest of it, and that he could order because he thought he understood the currents and where all this stuff was going, yada, yada, yada. So you've got that kind of intellectual, interesting background where all this stuff kind of foments from. You then have everyone thinking, we're jolly smart. And then the First World War happens. And I think European civilization in particular, probably it's not an original thing to say, hasn't fully recovered. I think how we were also jolly smart and yet we got into this problem. So desperate for this not to happen again that we fell into the Second World War. And at that point, you've got all these interesting currents going around that is best described by James Burnham, who wrote a book called The Managerial Revolution, who again came along and said, you go into the Industrial Revolution, all these places, and the capitalists take over, which is the sort of same prognosis as the kind of Marxist idea. But maybe a bit more value neutral on it. I obviously think the capitalists taking over was a great thing and led to all the sort of wonderful explosion in life expectancy and freedom and all the rest. And Burnham then said, well, what replaces that? Because the state grows, more money, more complication. Is this the man of system or the rationalists or the managerial class? And Burnham wrote this in 1941, 42, 43. He was American and seeing what was going on in the war at the time from a bit of distance, but it's shocking how prescient that is now. And it was happening at the same time that FDR over in the States was massively expanding the size of the state in line with a lot of these historical and intellectual and economic trends that were happening. You get this explosion of executive agencies and all the rest of it in DC. At the same time in Europe, and specifically in Britain, you've got this happening in response to the Second World War, that leads someone like Friedrich Hayek to write The Road to Serfdom, where he says, if you continue doing all this total war, complete command economy stuff that you need to do to build enough Spitfires and to fight the war and to beat the Nazis, if you keep doing this in peacetime afterwards, because you think, oh, we're going to have all the control and all the rest of it, you will snuff out freedom, you will snuff out economic freedom and enterprise and all the rest of it, and you will be on the road to serfdom, as the title of the book says. And that came out about the same time, and that was also incredibly prophetic. So you had all that led, certainly in Britain, to the kind of post-war consensus that we'd gone from being one of the most industrial and enterprising and free societies to one that was completely command and control. The Attlee government nationalised everything. They kept, as we've heard at this conference today, they kept rationing going for longer than they needed to, and great swathes of industry were nationalised in a parliament in a bit. And the Tories never went back on this. And we wondered why by the 1970s everything had fallen apart. And it took the Thatcher Revolution, this is my kind of hagiography of all this, to understand the need for that classical liberalism to come back, the freedom of economic activity and of choice and all that stuff, along with the other bit of that I think is necessary, which is behaving responsibly. That's the other part of a kind of, I would say, conservatism that needs to go alongside that. And we could probably go back all the way to the sort of French Revolution stuff, but let's not get bogged down in any of that. So Thatcher manages to do that with the economy, but never really wrestles with the other bit of it, which is the sort of large bureaucracy. The man of system is still in place. It's obviously the case in Europe as well, where the European project was always designed to prevent future wars happening, which meant more control out of the hands of the people and so on. And the European Union eventually comes out of all of that as well. And in America, likewise, the massive executive authority of these agencies and all the rest of it that's grown. So you see the same thing happening from largely intellectual, similarly intellectual and economic and political and militaristic reasonings, to a point where the unelected bureaucracy, the deep state, the management class, the man of system, the rationalists, whatever you want to call them, have got all this power. And that invalidates and breaks what I think we have learned works from political philosophy more broadly. So I'll use a British example and then I'll shut up. The glorious revolution that comes along in 1688 that gives Britain this amazing constitutional settlement that makes us top nation in short order afterwards ought to make some of the great English political theorists very happy. Parliamentary sovereignty means that you've got enough power to actually do things. So Hobbes ought to be happy to some extent with the kind of idea of Leviathan, the sovereign that can protect people. Locke ought to be happy with his second treatise because you've got the consent of the governed and you've got the feedback mechanism that comes in of the people with regular elections. Edmund Burke should be broadly happy because in our system you're still thinking about the wisdom of the ages and tradition and all that sort of stuff. And actually, if you wanted to say you've got the crown in Parliament as the technical thing that's sovereign in, so there's a sort of religious dimension that should appease and appeal to people there as well. In that sort of settlement, you should have a great system for getting things done, for avoiding civil wars, which is obviously what Hobbes wanted in the first place. In Britain, all of those things have been eroded, if not almost completely destroyed, by the first set of processes that I talked about. So you no longer have power to act as a sovereign parliament, the way that Hobbes would want, in order to address problems that come along, because you have this sort of blob, this administrative state, deep state, whatever you want to call it, people that have all these power and the quangos and the civil service and all the rest of it. You don't really have Locke's kind of consent of the governed anymore, because elections don't matter very much anymore, right? When Starmer came in England in 2024, how many people across the entire British state changed jobs? 200. 100 ministers, most of whom are MPs as well. So they're working 4 days a week at most. Friday they go off to their constituencies. And 100 special advisors, of which I was one, who constitutionally aren't allowed to tell civil servants what to do and have no power, and are limited to saying, boss, please don't sign that because I've read it and they're lying to you. And I'll only have to say I told you so when it all goes wrong, right? Which I got bored of saying. And that's it. And everybody else in that deep state stayed exactly the same. So the consent mechanism's gone. And the rationalist worldview is very year zero, kind of blank slate liberal, in the sense that it thinks the man of the wisdom of the ages, or the wisdom of the unlettered men, and all these things that Burke talks about, and tradition, or when Oakeshott talks about traditional knowledge, and Scruton talks about this sort of accretive sense of knowledge that isn't necessarily needing to be written down, that all gets ignored as well. So the great strengths of the British Constitution are gone. And they've gone because of these big processes that we've got in place now. And until you get politicians that realise that, and of course Europe has the same thing with the EU, America be a bit different, but there are still the very powerful forces in their central bureaucracy and all the rest of it there. So I think that's a very rough canter through quite a lot of big ideas of why we've got to the point that we're in now, where in Britain certainly, and I think in Europe, you've got this kind of stasis because that allows for entrenched interest to take over and to ruin the sort of sense of legitimacy that is supposed to be garnered from some of those big ideas of the Hobbes and the Locke and all the rest of it. And we can see the material results of that now when nothing works anymore and we're in masses of debt and nobody's happy and all the rest of it.
Loosely speaking, then, it's derived from people believing they know what's best for other people. And I think actually what you mentioned there is that I think that's one of the things that the average person on the street has no idea, that when a government changes, a lot of the civil service, it remains exactly the same.
It's wild, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I only really discovered it in the last few years because I've been sort of forced to think about things like this. Right. But and I know, correct me if I'm wrong here, but you're supposed to be apolitical as a civil servant, right? But I used to work at the BBC. It's like the BBC is supposed to be apolitical, but it's not apolitical at all. All my friends thought a certain way, and whether they sort of outwardly express it or not, it seeps into the culture, obviously. Of course. And I think civil servants tend to not be conservatives. Is that fair to say?
So short answer, yes. Slightly longer answer, and I won't take up as much time as I did with my previous one.
I love hearing you speak. Please carry on. Very eloquent.
What was it, Conquest, who had these sort of 3 laws of politics, and one of them is that everybody is conservative about that which he knows. So even the person that thinks brutalist architecture is great and it's great to knock down castles to put up horrible concrete carbuncles will then become very defensive about them if you wanted to pull them down to put something else up, for example. And so in their ways, I think a lot of the civil servants get kind of small c conservative because they think they know best and they don't like change coming along because they're suspicious of it. So small c principles there. But by and large, I think that they think that they are the legitimate real power in the country, whose job it is to keep things going the way they were taught that it was, and that the elected ministers and the spads, of whom again very small number, are broadly viruses in a system to which they are the antibodies. And because there's so many of them, because they can stay as long as they want, there's no parliamentary term limits for them, they're always going to outlast you and they're always going to outnumber you. And so that's the mindset as well. And then you have got, I think, kind of left-wing people, because by and large it's a sort of left-wing idea to think that the state can do good. Whereas on the right, you're more sceptical without the price mechanism or the profit motive in there of getting stuff done. With a few small exceptions in the sort of, I think, secret squirrel bits where they're all probably quite sound. The guys that work in immigration and the Home Office are all quite sound because they spend all day dealing with paedophiles and rapists and terrorists and criminals and all the rest of it. And I think that probably has quite a dampening effect on your sympathy for wrong-uns.
I wondered whether as well the idea of working as a civil servant was maybe a sort of it appealed more to people who didn't like taking risks, basically.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point.
And it's a long-term, probably a pretty secure job, I would imagine. I don't really know.
Oh, massively, yeah. It's almost impossible to get fired. I think a study came out a few weeks ago in England that said that you're more likely to die in the job than to be fired in the civil service, right? And the pension is obviously phenomenally good, and so you're incentivized to stick around. It's hard to get in to the civil service in mid-rank and almost impossible at higher ranks because they basically entirely promote internally, which, unlike the American system, where you do 4 years or whatever, and then you probably, your party loses, you got to go and do something else, learn how the world has changed, have some more skills so you can go in at a higher level 4 years, 8 years later. You just stay where you are in the civil service. And so the extraordinary advances bypass them completely, entirely. Something like COVID, just quickly, my old boss, a guy called Nadim Zahawi, who did the vaccine rollout, which I think in the States was called Operation Warp Speed, that the equivalent in Britain for that. And he was a guy who founded a business that's got a market cap of billions now called YouGov, and very successful businessman, and was so shocked with some of the stories when he would tell civil servants something and they'd say, all right, the plan is obviously to get these vaccines delivered to the country. Okay, well, you've got to deliver the vaccines at a sub-zero temperature. What experience has the civil service got, or the medical approval board, or the health whatever bits? What experience have you guys got of moving vaccines at scale at sub-zero temperatures? Well, none, Minister. But he's okay. What experience have you got of moving vaccines at all at sub-zero temperatures? Well, none. What experience have you got of moving anything anywhere? Well, none, but we're going to need okay, can you just Google the logistics industry? And you go, oh yeah, look at that, that's really useful. It turns out you can move like ice cream or whatever, and so you could retcon it from that. And the civil service hadn't thought about that, because I think that the world of risk-taking, as you say, the business world, it's not just alien to them, it's something that they are suspicious about. Because of the fear of corruption, there's all sorts of stuff put in place, at least in the British system, and I think in others as well, to be seen to be avoiding any kind of whiff of corruption, and therefore that turns into a suspicion that any business interacting with the state just wants to get something off you, wants to get advantage, wants to weaken protections for the little guy because they're rapacious profit mongers. And that is a very widespread feeling in the civil service.
Going back to the very macro view of this, which is people thinking they know what's best for everyone, is that cyclical, or is that a glitch in the human psyche, or do we sort of have a renaissance out of that type of? Because obviously in my world, the world of the free market makes so much sense to negate any thoughts I might have, apart from with my children, of course. But the average person I meet, of course, I have absolutely no idea what's good for them necessarily. And I want them to decide anyway. I want to see the results of all this input of different people. And it does seem a little bit less evolved to think that you know what's better for other people. I don't know. It's a bit like patronising to say that.
Yeah.
So I mean, do we evolve out of it, or does this cyclical thing keep happening? And obviously, what we see now is probably a very deep in the cycle of telling people what to do. Government's massive, bureaucracy is huge. There's no business people in the government, as far as I can tell. We've gone right to that end. So I mean, do we ever? Does this ever change?
I like your idea of things feeling cyclical. I think that's a good way to think about it. I don't think you can evolve out of it. The Bible talks about that we'll want to recognise the mote or the splinter in our neighbour's eye, but not the log in our own eye, right? Or the classic kind of judge not lest ye be judged. So I think that tendency is always there. And Hayek is good on this, where in the kind of the Fatal Conceit, I think was his last book, it talks about this idea. And Hayek is really charitable about the man of system, or the lefties, or whatever you want to call them, because he thinks, well, they're quite smart people and they're compassionate people. I'm not always sure I agree with him on that bit, but because they're smart, they think, well, there's still suffering in the world and there's still some bad things. I'm smart and I care. So if I change this system, I'm going to make it better for people. And he ascribes that nice, well-meaning, well-intentioned mindset as a big problem that ends up, when you have the power of the state, in corrupting everything and all the rest of it. And so I think that's more likely. And where the genius is, I guess, in the federal system in the United States, is that those laboratories of democracy can play off against each other, and you can see what works. And if school choice is going to work in Mississippi, other states might start adopting it, being pro-tech in California, yada, yada, yada. Whereas Britain, and massively now the EU, trying to standardise everything, because one size fits all, we know best practice, all that stuff, that smashes away that kind of human flourishing. And I also like your cyclical point, because I think that you end up getting lefty governments in wherever they are that spend always the same, always spend too much money, always over-regulate and all the rest of it, and eventually economic reality sets in and forces a change. And you see that, I guess, the beautiful fact that Reagan and Thatcher were in power at the same time and able to lead that once. And we've got to hope that that will happen again.
I think we're seeing a version of that in Central America at the moment.
Yeah, yeah.
They've had a long road with serfdom and socialism. And one by one, all right, Venezuela's slightly different, but one by one they're dropping now. And
Venezuela's like the control, isn't it? Right? Because you see in Argentina this stuff happening. You see the way that I suppose in El Salvador is again a bit different, but very interesting what's happening there, and they can maybe move on to the economic freedom bits now. All the while, Venezuela has been this corrupt command economy with more oil than any other country in the world, and people are resorted to eating their pets and zoo animals. So I think you're right.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, if it's cyclical, what do we just play our hand and watch it happen? Because a lot of people believe this is, there's an outcome which favors everyone. And that would imply that it doesn't. There's always going to be people, and I'm with you on that one. I don't believe the world is fair, just, all these things. There's a complete randomness in the world, and as a result, if you're lucky, then you have a certain type of life. If you're unlucky, you have a different type of life. But really, the sort of centralizing force, which is, like I say, where we're at the moment. It must exist for some good, even though it tends to end in, mayhem, really, and a lot of death and destruction. When you talk about the decentralizing force, it's easier to argue that it doesn't end badly. Can you get too decentralized? I suppose you can. You could get hedonism, maybe, or something, and no one cares about anything, and there's a lot of infighting at that point, maybe.
Yeah, I suppose the example that some would use, I guess, would be Somalia, right? Where total breakdown of law and order, no respect to property rights, all the rest of it, and it becomes the Hobbesian war of all against all. Or whatever. And again, actually interesting natural experiment to some extent with Somaliland as a breakaway statelet that is doing better because it tries to respect some more of these things. So I think you're right that the decentralizing thing has less risk to it, probably because every time it gets tried, it's starting from a very high base. If you think about where we'd got to in the 1970s in Britain, Thatcher had an awful lot of decentralizing and devolving and reforming to do. And then, you can only do so much of it in a kind of political world before a lefty will come in again and say, well, things are so nice now, you don't need to worry about this. We can go back to being nice and sweet and all the rest of it, which is why the kind of constant vigilance, as the Blessed Margaret did say, you've got to fight a battle more than once in order to win it. If you can bring state interference down and tax burdens down and spending down as much as possible, that will be, I guess, a kind of buffer against the re-encroachment of these ideas and burdens and all the rest of it. I'm trying to think of some good examples where that hasn't happened because governance has been so good. I mean, Singapore is a great example in all sorts of ways. Okay, it doesn't have some of the freedoms in terms of being able to speak your mind or leave chewing gum on the floor, which is not a great freedom anyway. But it's gone in a generation from third world to first, as Lee Kuan Yew said, and has stayed amazing basically ever since because it's got a broad set of things right, which is really impressive.
I think people misunderstand freedom as being freedom from rules always. And I think the most important freedom is the freedom to opt in or out of something, which with Singapore is you can. You can choose to live there, you can choose not to. Right. It's up to you. And I mean, I don't know how much you know about the Free Cities movement that we're part of, but we advocate for this exact governance, competition between governance. And, the more the merrier. America's a great example of an experiment which goes along further down that line than most. Yeah. And appears to be super successful.
And by the way, the American system helps ward against all these sort of federal centralizing powers, which I suppose is what the founding fathers were warning against. Because if it's going terribly in New York, as it has been for a while, and will get much worse now in California, the beneficiaries will be the Tennessees and the Texases and all the rest of it, right? It's a great system in that sense.
If we had a federal system here, I'd tell you I would move to Buckingham. This is a wonderful little place. I've never been here before. It's an amazing little place, isn't it?
It is.
I don't know what the politics are like here, but it's, it's walking
Well, to some
around.
extent, it doesn't matter, does it? Because we're so centralised. I think Britain is the most centralised economy in the OECD in terms of the amount of taxes that are raised at the centre. London has this. If you talk about free cities, it's so overpowering in terms of what's the model in the United Kingdom that smart kids or academically smart kids are told to go off to university somewhere, Oxford, Cambridge, Durham, Exeter, Warwick, whatever other places, and then by and large move to London because that's where all the jobs are, and it becomes the cultural capital and the economic capital and the political capital and all the rest of it, and has a great, if London's doing great, but it's been run by a bloke for so long now who has let crime go and all the rest of it, and it's horrendous. And I left London, not because I think you get any more political freedom, but just to get out to a small village somewhere where you are free of the effects that people have been voting for in that way.
We did it a number of years ago as well. I live on a farm now. I've gone right to the very extreme. We live about half a mile down a track.
Amazing.
But it sounds, it's not strange, not where we live anyway. But it's real. I really, I've gone down the philosophical road of leave me alone, leave me alone, leave me alone, to the point now where I live down the end of a track. It's not that and we have minimal contact with the government, it has to be said. You really feel that you have minimal contact. Every now and then I have to dip my toes into the bureaucratic world, and I realise how fortunate we are. But it annoys me. It shouldn't be like that. It shouldn't be like that. It wasn't like that even when I was, I lived in London. I worked out of London for 7 years. Even there, that was only 20 years ago. It felt completely different, and my freedoms were much more evident. Never thought about freedom of speech until the last few years. Never thought at all about it, even, and now that you do think about it, you realise that we have a terrible system here for freedom of speech compared to, say, the federal system.
Yeah, massively. My wife is from the United States. She's a Hoosier from the great state of Indiana. And she said to me recently, I never appreciated what the First Amendment gave me in terms of enshrining my right to say what I want without fear and all the rest of it until the last few years of living here. And she's lived here for a while now, and to feel the way that has turned. And I think because, again, the man of system, the rationalist, whatever you want to call it, genuinely has never had the philosophical groundings about freedom explained to them, ordered liberty, right? As you say, it's not just about license to become hedonists or whatever, but the ability to act independently because you want to tinker and come up with new things and new ideas and all these sorts of things. They never come into any of this stuff. I don't think we teach it very well in school, teach the benefits of it. It's easy to be mocked. So for an example, inside government, I was in the Department for Education during some of the COVID issues, and the Omicron wave was coming in, and I sat in a meeting and they said, right, we are, partly because the trade unions want us to, we're going to insist that every child, including in primary schools, is to wear a mask during the wave of this all day long, even though when they're sat down at their desks. And that's okay because it's a zero cost intervention. And I was the one person in that room, because obviously I'm the only political person in there, and the rest are all civil servants. I said, well, but what about their freedom? Right? What about their personal expression? And you'd assume that I'd called their mum a whore or something, right? It was that and then it was more like, oh, you've just said that that grass is blue, or they couldn't get their heads around this idea. But it's zero cost, and so I forced them to go away and do a study that reported back and said, actually, no, it's not a zero cost, and here are the problems, yada yada yada. Because there's no mechanism for saying you're encroaching on their freedom and all the rest of it. And there will be some people who will say, yeah, but what about the freedom not to catch COVID and all the rest of it? We're talking about primary school kids here and mostly young teachers and all the rest. And COVID is an interesting example, I think, of people going, wait a minute, God, my liberty really can be taken away from me at the drop of a hat and all the rest of it. So,
but in my case, I had never really contemplated liberty really until 2020.
Yeah.
Not in a tangible way. And is that, at the heart of it, and your wife's American, so you know America, obviously. When you go to America, there is a liberty. It's in the DNA, and there's also even a liberty movement. I've been to conferences with 5,000 people there, just going there for liberty and things like this, and it's all kinds of people, young, old, whatever. Why don't we get that bit? What is it about living on our little island here that we don't seem to care about that? unless it's like thrust into our faces, like when we were told to not come out of our house. And I said, no, I'm coming out of my house. It was hard. It was hard to see all those people sort of look with dagger eyes looking at you, doing things you didn't, But in America, it's like you feel the power of this abstract constitution, which kind of, it's like an abstract power that you have. Because at the end of the day it's there, or in the case of freedom of speech, that the Bill of Rights is there for you, and it's a force. I know we don't have that, but why do we not even think about it much? It's not in our DNA. I mean, arguably we were the first, was it the 1600s, when people started thinking about individualism and liberty and this kind of stuff, and freedom of speech, freedom of expression, all this kind of stuff. Why didn't we adopt it properly?
So I think we did adopt it, and I think we adopted it actually even much earlier than that, and before people were consciously putting it into philosophies. There's an amazing book called The Origins of English Individualism by a man called Alan Macfarlane. I've got a young Padawan called Sam Bidwell, who some people might know from Twitter, who's obsessed with this book and goes on about it all the time. And he points out that England, and England in particular, different in the deepest ways possible, even than our continental neighbours, even ones quite similar to us, like the Dutch and the Danes. The English used to, and still, would marry relatively late, for example, much later than you would assume, looking kind of church records, and move into very nuclear families very early on. I'll build up into answering your question in a second, in a way that doesn't happen even on the sort of southern bits of the European continent. And so you would kind of a very small family unit, mum, dad, kids, and then they'd grow up and go off and all the rest of it. So you wouldn't have big multi-generational families, and you would move place to place based on where the work was, and therefore you don't build up the kind of cousin marriage, clannish networks that you get in other places, because you don't have blood ties with these people you've moved to for work, but you develop a kind of oikophilia, as Greeks call it, a love of place or whatever, and these other ties that bind, that make you act as if they are a kind of blood relation. You're trusting them and all the rest of it, but you're not having to bind these things in with marriage, which obviously has consanguinity issues and all the rest of it. It allows you to develop more individual characteristics. That allows you to hire the best person for a job, and so meritocracy kind of comes along, and more freedom that way, and freedom to move and to tinker and to get away from the cloying embrace of parents if you want to. And these things all come from very, very deep roots, and I think Macfarlane can take it back even further to sort of, that's because we followed sheep around more or whatever, and he does all that kind of sociology stuff much better than I'd be able to give it justice to here. And so that stuff was in the DNA, certainly from the Norman conquest, and actually he would argue from before. The Saxons, Anglo-Saxons, had a different kind of conception of this. The king didn't automatically just get to become king again. The Witan had to meet, and all these. So I think these deep, deep, deep currents, and again influenced, I would say, by bits of Christianity and all the rest, and some other great books we can talk about if you want to on that. That builds up into this different system than we had, and the earlier wranglings about how that manifests itself in a power sense of the English Civil War, the constitutional settlement that I opened with, and all the rest of it, that gets exported to the New World, definitely gets exported to the United States, what became the United States, to the point that Edmund Burke, very, very sympathetic to the American revolutionaries, right? I had a cry in the church in Boston where Paul Revere did the whole, one by two, one by night, whatever it is, one by sea, the heartbreak that we're no longer officially one civilization still, right? Because it is a shared inheritance. And you get some slightly sniffy Yanks who go, oh yeah, you're just the ancestors of the people who weren't brave enough to leave the island, and we're the pioneers and all that stuff, which I think is rot, by the way, because after losing the colonies, this island sent people out and conquered the world and sent common law and all these ideas to other places as well, like Australia and New Zealand and India and great swathes of Africa and the Middle East and all the rest of it. So I think we did have all this stuff, and that sense of English liberty versus the absolutism of Louis XIV, or then the horrors of the French Revolution and the kind of reaction, all this stuff. So I think we've got this great history of that and that level of freedom and the first sort of mother of all parliaments, all these things. I think we lose it to some extent after the Second World War. They're exactly the reasons that Hayek talks about in combination with that sort of managerial revolution. Right? The Attlee government had, Clement Attlee, who obviously came after Winston Churchill, had one parliament of 5 years and then like another year afterwards. And then Labour didn't get back into power again for ages, and even then they've never been as revolutionary or radical. Didn't need to be, because they so changed everything so fast, nationalising everything, nationalising health and industry and all the rest of it. And we're still stuck with that now, and we're stuck with it. And people think perhaps because we've got the Americans as this sort of very similar but very different example, that they're all gun-toting and talking about freedom, and therefore that's not the English way, which Thatcher proved wasn't true either. And she said, when you people are free to choose, they choose freedom. And I think we can do that again, and I think we need to do that again.
I mean, I'm just thinking about after the war, and like you say, did we ever have that freedom though? If it could be sort of taken away that easily? I mean, when you look at the American version of freedom, you realise it's the people kind of enforcing it, and guns are a huge part of that, you know. But so it would be taking away freedom in the UK is very easy, and by the sounds of the way you described it, then after the war, it was probably framed as, correct me if I'm wrong, we need to do this because it's important for the country. We need to take away freedom, you know. Now in America, that doesn't cut as well, because people really do want to then defend that right. We don't really have a good way of defending it other than saying something. And when it's free speech that's being quelled anyway, it doesn't really work, does it?
I guess the Americans are lucky and unlucky with their constitution being as sovereign and powerful as it is. Obviously, it's not infallible because there are a bunch of amendments to it, and the idea that there will never be another one again seems odd to me, because our system is actually very different. You know, we've got this same history, same sort of philosophical roots, all the rest of it. Our political systems are actually shockingly different, because in Britain, no parliament can tie the hands of its successor. There's no law that is, or with a few exceptions that I think are legitimate, there's no law that is any stronger than any other that couldn't just be repealed with a simple majority in parliament, essentially. And I think Attlee or someone basically says that all the power that Lenin sought with the bullet, the British Constitution gives you with the ballot. And so you have, as I said at the start, this parliamentary system that does allow you to do great things very quickly. And if people don't like it, the idea is you should be able to vote against it at a general election and change course again. So you should be able to do a similar version over every 4-year cycles that I guess the states can do in that experimenting. I think the problem probably was that we got whacked in the First World War, and lost a lot of great people and quality men and all the rest of it. We're still shaken by that in the run-up to the Second World War. So the effort of winning that war totally expended huge amounts of will and all the rest of it in Britain, right? Standing alone against the Luftwaffe, all these sorts of national stories that are largely true, and we should still be proud of our ancestors for doing it. You lose the empire in the course of it, you lose a lot more great people, you lose a lot more ideas about it, and then the well-meaning Clement Attlee, all sweet and modest, comes along and says, we've won the war, now let's win the peace. And you end up with socialism, which has been a cancer ever since. And it's not been rowed back fast enough. Churchill didn't manage to row it back when he came back in because so much of it had been done, and then he was poorly. And then the economic malaise that grips you is so difficult. The old thing that you can vote yourself into socialism, but you've got to shoot your way out. Well, we got halfway out again with Maggie, and then I think we've squandered it again. And we could have done it maybe again after Brexit, and we haven't done it again now. So I think that there may be materialist reasons why not. There's nothing constitutionally that says we're any less free, particularly, that you couldn't get rid of with a stroke of a few pens and a few bills in a new parliament.
What's your stance? This is going to sound a bit odd, but what do you think about democracy? Like a lot of 50% of the people we have on this podcast are not in favour of democracy, really. And for many reasons, a lot of people believe it always leads to socialism. It's the democratic system itself which results in socialism. What's your view on it? You've been on the inside. You're probably you don't have to be diplomatic either. I suppose you do.
I probably do have to, yeah. If I ever want to get voted into anything, yeah. I mean, Churchill said it's the worst form of government apart from all the others. I'm sure you've had other people say that. And was it NHL Mencken or someone else? You know, the people have spoken, the bastards, right? I think the alternative to having that mechanism of changing course is very, very is not obvious to me what a better alternative is. You're not going to get an Aristotelian Platonic philosopher king anytime soon. If you can't change course, you can't correct for big problems, which we're seeing in China, for example, now, right? It's all going so well because they can just do what they want and all the rest of it. Well, their economy would be much, much bigger and stronger than it currently is because of a load of decisions that President Xi has made since he's been in office, and no one's brave enough to correct him. Ditto Russia. They'd be in a much stronger, better place if they hadn't been this massive kleptocracy or the rest of it. And a proper democracy would be able to fix that. I guess my contention in Britain, at least, is that we don't have as proper a democracy as we could, partly for this reason that we... that so much of the apparatus of state doesn't change when people do, as I say. It's not just only 200 people that change jobs. When you're in a department, like I use the Department for Education, for example, 4 advisors, 4 or 5 ministers, 8,000 civil servants. Right, just to give a scale, that's just one department, for example. It's not one of the biggest. I think the other problem, and this will be controversial, is that democracies work when there is a collective and cohesive national story to tell and that everybody buys into. And that doesn't need to be, and it ideally doesn't, it is not an ethnic based thing. And the whole blood and soil stuff, I don't think really it works very nicely at all, obviously. And I see why people get tempted by it because they think that it's the only way to make people cohere together. But when you have academic studies that say in multi-ethnic societies, the crucial thing is to push those differences down and have a collective idea of what binds us and the more in common and all that sort of nice stuff. And what do we do with woke and DEI and all the rest of it? We do the opposite. We highlight all the differences. And when you import lots of people and you don't forcibly integrate them into explaining our system and the rest of it, and you end up with a multicultural system or society that Britain now is, then democracy doesn't work because you're going to only go after different groups. I think the United States has this to a large extent where both parties will go, right, we need to say these things to appeal to African American voters and this to Hispanics and this to the Vietnamese Americans and whatever else. And Britain is rapidly moving towards that. You saw the Muslim Vote as an organisation that was founded. There was a Hindu manifesto, a Yoruba manifesto for ethnic Yoruba people in Nigeria, and all these other groups, and people starting to appeal to them in Britain. When that happens, I think then you've got a real problem. So I think democracy works if everybody is in on the collective consciousness and that kind of idea that you are all one people and you have the same love of the same place.
Talking of exactly that, and I was surprised. This is the first time I've been to this kind of a conference in the UK. And I was I think the panel I watched this morning, which you were on, is the Conservative Party dead, right? And what I noticed immediately in the first few hours of listening to people talk and the questions is a lot of people were mentioning reform, and this is very UK specific, but I just want to know what your take on this is. Talking about reform, and no one was mentioning restore, which I think in my world, when we look at restore, we see the real threat to, say, conservatism, because it is what it's saying is what people often are thinking quietly. Going back to what you were saying about this is what happens when you don't have a national identity. Things arise and people try and create that identity again. I think what Restore are doing is exactly that. That they're basically saying, "Oh, hold on a minute. This is what we were. Let's be that again." And a lot of people who have been in this country a long time agree with that, and I can see that. I noticed that just down the pub, in my local village, people are listening to that and thinking, "Yeah, that's what I really like." I forget where I'm going with this. Oh, yeah. I just wanted to know why it is no one was really taking... It didn't seem like anyone was taking Restore seriously. Whereas from my outsider view, I'm not in the political sphere at all. I talk to lots of people and I listen to what's said down the pub. That's people think Restore is a really good alternative. So why are people taking this seriously here or not? As a threat to them? I mean, if you're talking about conservatives and conservatism, I'd say that is their threat, because they're what they're talking about and what they're actually saying, whether or not they do it, who knows? But is what is about a national identity again.
I'm all for a national identity. I think that given where we are, and given where we have always been, and given where we were with the British Empire and all these sorts of things, the idea that we would waste time in a new right of centre government working out who was actually, quote, ethnically English, and deciding to send back, wherever back is, a load of people who just happen to be born with black skin or whatever else, which is, and I'll come to defend that in a second. I think this is completely wrong. It's a waste of time. It's morally wrong. It's a totally misconception of how a lot of this country has developed, and it comes from the fact that with okay, so let's start with this. The start of this Restore movement. This is a guy called Rupert Lowe, who was elected as a member of Reform UK, and he was great on Twitter, right? And he was great also in the Public Accounts Committee in the British Parliament. The Tories actually gave him a slot in there later on, but he was very good at using the powers of an MP to write questions and all this sort of stuff. He then gets kicked out of Reform, and I don't think they did it in a very nice way. There was all sorts of accusations, and it was all deeply unpleasant. He sets up this thing called Restore that I joined it was a sort of pressure group, I guess, and I thought this is a great idea. And then it pops up as a political party, as yet another political party to sluice more votes away from the whatever inevitable wranglings there'll need to be at the next election on the right. Whether Reform cannibalise the Tory party recovers, you now make it more difficult with these guys coming along. The structural problem I've got is that this guy, Rupert Lowe, I like very much. I've had dinner with him, very sound guy, all the rest of it, is basically a kind of classic Thatcherite Tory. It looked like he might join the Tories if Robert Jenrick had taken over in May from Kemi Badenoch, for example. And he talks a good sound game on all this kind of stuff. He's not writing his own tweets, right? Like what the guy says when he's in person with a camera in front of him, when he's doing a Twitter live or whatever it's called, is different in both the tone of what's being said and in the content of what's being said than what the guy is tweeting. And it's just there are demonstrable differences that people on X have highlighted. Whereas he, when he's speaking himself, says things like, "No, I've never said I'd take passports away from anybody." In which case, the Restore platform, if that's what their actual platform is no different from Reform's or now from the Conservatives. And yet then on Twitter, he's a lot punchier. And the accusations are that there are some young, smart, if slightly over enthusiastic people around him who are pushing some of this stuff. And I think there's a problem there if you've got young, enthusiastic people who can take actually a sort of rationalist, man of system, almost year dot approach of going, I don't like this, I'm going to make this all clean and nice and all the rest of it and blah, 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 blah. Which leads to one of these guys popping up on GB News and telling a black woman who is a host on GB News, that even though she was born in Newcastle and she's really right-wing, that she's not really English. And I get that you can talk about not being English ethnically. Fine, I agree with that. Rishi Sunak, not ethnically English, but in his mannerisms and and I don't like Rishi Sunak at all. I think he's a rubbish prime minister and all the rest of it. He's almost painfully English, right? He's awkward. He likes cricket, and he's clearly being like slightly browbeaten by his wife, and all these sorts of like deep tropes and stuff. But the obsession with going, well, he's not really English though, is he? Who's that helping? Who's that turning on? Who's that turning off? And when it comes to then the horrendous problems that we all know there are in the country of debt and of actual Boris wave migrants who have come over here who are totally culturally incompatible and do need to go and all the rest of it, you're just drawing away support for average normal people who know there's a problem but don't like it when people are a bit too bombastic about it. So that's why I've got a problem. I think others do about Restore as well, in the sort of the optics of all of this.
Interestingly,
and just like what I said, the alternative on the immigration point is there will be some people that want that kind of bombastic approach. Many others want this issue to be sorted, but will just get squeamish if you see the stuff on British streets that we saw in Minneapolis. However right I think it is to only have people who are legally here, and however right I think it is that actually there is a conversation to be had about people who were given passports in Britain who should not have been given them, and who will only be a drain on state resources forever, and their kids and their families coming over and all the rest of it. Those people are only administratively British, like the guy who was Egyptian who'd never been here, who was given a passport to get him out of an Egyptian jail. That guy's not British. I don't think he ever will be, given all the stuff he said he wants to kill all the whites and the Americans and whatever else. So what actually is necessary is a sort of Katie Lamb type approach from the Conservative Party, and she's a backbench MP who put forward what the Conservative policy was for a little bit at least, until I think Kemi got scared of it, which was saying, I'm ever so sorry, it's a pity that you're here, you shouldn't have been given that passport, and we're just going to take it back. Which is what the Swedes have started to do after decades of letting in so many Somali gangsters that there is a Wikipedia page for grenade attacks in Malmo. They've started paying to say, right, here's 5,000 krona, we'll take the passport back, off you go. So that kind of more administrative, bureaucratic approach is the only way that's going to work at any scale that actually works. But that doesn't do so well on the Twitter retweets.
Funnily enough, what I know about Rupert Lowe, I've got from long-form interviews that he's been on, actually.
Yeah.
It was just that it was a couple of weeks ago. You might find... this is why I think that they, at least on paper, are a major force that a lot of people aren't necessarily saying yet. I was at my local pub, and we were talking about politics, as you do in a pub, and it's very small.
Every pub's a parliament, right?
It's a very small pub, and you can walk in there, sit down, and you can become part of the conversation. It's one of those kind of pubs. And the subject of Rupert Lowe came up, and someone mentioned that he'd recently said, or maybe someone on his behalf by the sounds of it, if that's true, had said that they would ban halal and kosher slaughter. And you would be amazed. Everyone piped up in the pub, said, brilliant idea. And obviously we're a rural community. A lot of farmers don't like the idea of caring for their animals and then shipping them off to that kind of situation. Plus, we are a nation of animal lovers. And I often think that something as simple as that statement, could get a nation of animal lovers, for example, to rise up and vote in a particular direction. Now, I'd never heard it before, so I did Google it, and it's lo and behold, he said that we will ban it. Which, when I thought it through, and I ended up being the only one arguing that side of the story, I was thinking, wait a minute, you can't imagine the process of banning halal slaughter. I know a lot, around where I live, a lot of farmers, a lot of slaughterhouses have consolidated in the Birmingham area, because there's a lot of the trade in lamb goes in a certain direction to a certain demographic in society, and blah, blah, blah. So there's this whole economic part of that story. And when I thought it through, I thought, you can't do that, let alone the religious connotations, which really we shouldn't care about if you would say, right, in the UK, we are animal lovers. And as a result, halal slaughter is something that we don't agree with. You can do it anywhere else, but in our country, we would like it to not happen. Now, I can get that. I just was thinking about the logistics of trying to do that and thinking it's almost impossible to actually enforce that. How would you do that? There's a whole economy there. There's large swathes of communities that revolve around this. Even if I would agree, and I think I'd probably do. I don't like the idea of halal slaughter at all. I would say yes. I would vote for that. But the thought of it actually happening seems an impossibility. And so, is that the kind of thing you're saying? This is rhetoric, which sounds good. But when it comes to it, and this is what we so often see in politics now, is, they'll say anything to get in power. And then it's almost now like a joke that you just do the opposite. You just do the opposite, literally. And people are so disenfranchised and disappointed, they don't care anymore. Is that one of those things, the kind of,
Yeah, so let me start by saying that this is often a tactic that the civil service will use for ministers, saying it's too hard to do, it's very complicated, minister, it will take us years to work up the plans and all the rest of it. I think there's even a sort of the internet line, it's called having a Cheems mindset. That's like, there's no point in trying to do difficult things because someone would have done it already, otherwise it's too difficult to do and all the rest of it. So let's play out what it would actually look like. Halal...
and kosher, by the way.
Well, so this is exactly part of my point. That halal can be as simple as someone standing in an otherwise perfectly ethical slaughterhouse, saying a little prayer, and then the animal is humanely stunned and killed.
Can it?
That's I think in the majority of cases in Britain how it's supposed to work.
I didn't.
There are interpretations of the theology that say that doesn't count and that it has to be still alive and awake and everything. We've seen the most disgraceful images in some of these Muslim-run slaughterhouses where they've played the sounds of wolves very loudly to terrify the animals before they kill them.
Why?
Yep, because they're evil people. because and they think nothing of the sanctity of animal life.
Is that really true? That sounds like
I know it's the sort of thing that I now sound like a complete nutter for saying it, but completely true. And it's one of those things like the grooming gangs or whatever that is so evil and so awful to any decent person, just decent English person sensibility, that you just think it must not be possible to be true. But so that's at the other end of the spectrum. My understanding is that in the kosher method for observant Jewish people, I think it's shishikta or something of that effect. Theologically, the animal has to be alive and as conscious as possible, and therefore kosher food can only really be prepared in the sort of what we would consider quite a cruel way. Jews have been back in England since Cromwell let them back in the 1600s. So if you're an observant Jewish family, you've been here for 400 odd years, and you're suddenly told that you can't access any of this food that you need and that you're going to have to leave. Is that right? I don't know. It doesn't seem right to me, but it also doesn't seem right to me that an animal should be killed in a cruel way. But then to Dale Vince, the mad eco-lefty guy who funds the Labour Party, he thinks that eating animals at all is wrong. And so there's a complicated, interesting conversation that we could delve deeper into. Are we really, when it comes to, and can you do one without the other? Can you say, as some people might say, but so Jews have been here for 400 years and their contributions to society are enormous, look at the Nobel Prizes, yada yada, we'll make an exception for them, but not for halal, because the people that use halal arrived more recently and are less likely to be net contributors, right? Someone might make that argument, right? Which is, again, very tricky. Because others would have to say, in a liberal approach, you have to ban everything equally or not at all. These are interesting conversations. And this is the thing that we're going to focus, not you and I, but that a government is going to focus on trying to work out and spend all of its resources, energy on working out, rather than all the low-hanging fruit of an insane energy policy, an insane immigration policy, an insane regulatory policy, insane education, insane healthcare, no military, yada, yada, yada. So there's a problem there, I think, in terms of being reasonable and the rest of it. And the other bit of it is it just that you're creating a hostile environment for groups of people that you don't like? Because I don't like lots of people who have come to this country recently who are probably likely to eat halal food and probably want it in the most unpleasant way, because I've seen the problems of political Islamism and I've seen the problems of lack of cultural assimilation. And the school that I used to live near in North London had 5-year-old girls wearing hijabs, right? And I would ban in a heartbeat. It's totally un-British. The thing we've seen this last week of the Adhan, the call to prayer in Trafalgar Square, again, all the blokes at the front and the women in the hijabs at the back and so on. And so are we really talking about integration here? Is it actually about the animal welfare? These are really interesting and difficult conversations, and I've got my knee-jerk opinions on it that you'd have to think through, and you legitimately probably have to kind of consult on and all the rest of it. Is that what we're going to spend our time doing as a first government, to try and save the country from the doldrums that it's in?
Good point.
I'm not trying to be defeatist about it, but these are big conversations. And if you're going to say no, sorry, just to finish, if you're going to say don't care, it's awful, it's just bloody wrong, I'm just going to get it done, is that the same slapdash approach that we're going to take to the economy? Right, because that's kind of a bit where the Truss program went to. Just right, slapdash, just get it done. Governing's actually really hard, right? Labour fell for this, where they thought Tories were evil. Our theory of change is just get the evil Tories out and everything will be fine. And now the newspapers are full of Labour ministers and spads going, Christ, actually, it's really hard to do this. We're in such a pickle, it's very difficult. So you tell me. I don't know. What do you think about it?
Well, no, I was just thinking it through then. I would say that, and this is how I'm assuming how it happened. We invented, with regards to halal and kosher, we invented a rule that said, to be humane with an animal, you must stun it first before you kill it, and that makes sense. But there are these exceptions on religious grounds.
Yep.
So I would come at it from that stance. I would say, no, let's have no exceptions, because the idea is, the animal is bad enough that it's getting killed anyway, but why do it in a painful way? That's not something that I think anyone, well, no, that's not true, obviously. Plenty of people don't care. But I would say that if the law was that, and if the law was passed to say that, but there's these exceptions, then I would say it's not a real law then. Because the exceptions, especially if it was religious grounds.
Well, that's a very kind of liberal take in general, right? And with the stuff we've seen again from the prayer controversy in Trafalgar Square, Ed Davey from the Liberal Democrats saying, yeah, it's so un-British to suggest that people can't pray the way they want to, and so on. We had test acts on the statute for hundreds of years that forbade, Catholic worship or whatever, or fined you if you didn't go to church a number of times. Is that un-British? Because we did it for hundreds of years longer than we've been doing lots of other things that we now consider to be British and all the rest of it. So, I think, without trying to be a cop-out on it, I think a lot of this stuff is really difficult to be morally and ethically and politically consistent about. If what you're actually saying is you acknowledge there's a problem with cultural assimilation, okay, then let's talk about it like that. And if you think it's a problem about animal welfare, okay, let's talk about it like that. And then we get into a very intractable, messy problem of competing rights and balancing rights. It's always been a difficult thing, right? It's not just enough to have Mill's harm principle balancing how we behave towards one another. You have a right of an animal to not be killed in a nasty way versus the right of someone who's lived here for 400 years to do what he thinks his God tells him he's got to do in order to be a good person. Right? I might think that's silly. I might care more about the animal. How are we going to balance these things out? And if it's done in the spirit of actually, I just want to get rid of these people I don't like, that seems concerning. Okay. As much as I don't want a lot of those people to be here, if they're going to be forcing their 5-year-old girls to wear hijabs and do political Islamism and horrible stuff from the pulpit and all the rest.
I think the reason I brought it up at that particular one is because I think it's a cross-party issue, animal cruelty. And it's a really interesting one because it makes everyone think, especially, I would say, the left side of the aisle, who might say, well, that person should be able to do what they want to do. Oh, but hold on a minute. They want to hurt an animal.
Right. Right.
I think it's a phenomenal, it's a bit like, the kind of the abortion debate in a way. It's our version of it because we don't really care about abortion over here, but we love animals.
Right.
We really love them. And I would say that is part of at least my culture.
Yeah.
The love of animals is a British sentiment.
I
almost certainly
agree. Yeah. One of the reasons why we ended up leaving London was that we got a Cocker Spaniel called Tennyson because I thought it was the silliest thing to shout in a field, right? Come here, Tennyson. And the way that he was perceived by people who arrived recently, the dog got kicked, dog got spat on, they're terrified because there's a hadith that says that dog saliva cancels prayers and things. Doesn't seem right to me. We've been domesticating dogs and they've been domesticating us back for 40,000 years. And some of these ideas are much more modern than that. Much more recent than that. I hate that too. So I'm totally with you on that front. And yet, is this what we're going to prioritise? We're going to not have an economy that's fixed and a stupid energy policy because we're going to spend all our parliamentary time in debating all this stuff. Maybe. And again, I would like this to be a country where people are really pro-dogs and really pro-animal welfare and really well integrated and not forcing 5-year-old girls to wear hijabs and not, marrying their cousins and all these things. But to just kind of go, what's going to be a banger tweet that's going to stick it to Farage because he's a wet, done. That's not how it works. And that's not me being a mealy mad civil servant saying, Minister, it's too difficult because I don't want you to do it. There are difficult considerations to work out.
Right.
God, I sound like a centrist dad. I thought I was meant to be a radical.
We'll wrap it up in a sec. I just want to, going on from that then, you were saying, are we going to prioritise this? Right. You can prioritise whatever you want. How do you fix what's going on now, you personally, based on everything you know from inside the government, outside the government?
I think we need, from where we're standing now, there needs to be another year or so of the parties of the right and the left knocking 7 shades out of each other. I think that's actually quite healthy. My broad take is that there will be a sort of Darwinian survival of the fittest, or the survival of the most able to change or whatever approach, and that one party might just cannibalise the others. Maybe that's Restore, maybe that's Reform, maybe that's Tories, and then you end up, hopefully with some of the best quality of all of them in there. And that then you've got a reasonable prospect to give to the public. The fact that Reform and the Tories have got pretty similar policies on lots of areas is encouraging for that. So then you vote for the most robust right-wing party that can win. I think if you get into power with that, and the things that ought to be prioritised is an acknowledgement that the hour is even later than most people think, and that the economy will be so bad, unfortunately, by 2029, that we're not going to be able to do a lot of stuff straight away. You're going to have to ruthlessly prioritise massive deregulation to energy and to business in general, trying to attract investment here, trying to attract people back again. Then maybe you get no income tax for someone moving back from Dubai for a year or two, something like that, to try and get some of our best people back to try and rebuild things. And I think that alongside that, then there is a very serious policy on immigration that needs to happen, which is to turn back at least all the people who are in the country illegally, foreign criminals, all the rest of it. And there should be a conversation about people who were given passports in the last few years who are not contributing in any way, actively seem to be failing to integrate. That is very difficult to do, and that's probably not something that's going to be able to be done in all the fighting between the parties right now. Maybe it is, because you don't want to set precedents that say, well, hang on a minute, you now, in 2040, you don't subscribe to what Prime Minister Zach Polanski thinks a British person believes, therefore we're going to send you to the penal colony. Right? There is one thing we've seen in the last few years, slippery slopes are really real. So let's, at the first instance, you do the low-hanging fruit. I think then what you do is, to try and be a bit more sneakerson about it, is you look at the kind of the benefits and welfare system as we've got it, because we are paying huge amounts of money for people to sit on their asses and do nothing. Not people who are poorly or anything like that, but people who have recently arrived, and maybe they have now got ILR or they've got passports, but they don't contribute in any meaningful way and send money home and all the rest of it. Let's have a look at some eligibility criteria there, as I imagine that there's probably an awful lot that you could quite quietly do in order to encourage some of these people to no longer do it when they can't just sit on the taxpayer teat. And the last bit of that, I think, as well, is to just cut off all the funding to all these NGOs and the charities and all the rest of it as well. And that would get you an awful lot of the way there. And I think some other stuff about, on the political Islamism front of cutting off funding and looking at what some of our friends in the UAE and Saudi and stuff have done. Right? Look, in Saudi Arabia, you now have, the state has to approve what speeches are given by imams in mosques. And when Trump did that first appearance in Saudi, when he's sort of touching that weird orb in that thing, music was illegal in Saudi. And when Trump spoke last year, he ended his speech with YMCA from the village people, right? So there are big cultural big cultural changes that are happening in that part of the world that we should look at, and how they deal with extremism there. Banning the Muslim Brotherhood would be a great start, and all that would entail as well. And that would be a start. And then let's see after 5 years, when you fix the economy and got some military back again, and fix welfare payments, and sent back all the illegal immigrants, and stop the boats, and all the foreign criminals and all the rest of it. And then let's see, okay, all right, that sounds pretty good. Country's in a better way. Then we can start having thornier conversations about how much more needs to be done to force people to integrate, whilst at the same time promoting the best of British and all the rest of it.
One thing you didn't mention there, sorry, one last question. Reducing the size of the government. That would always be my issue. The government's too big. Yeah. There's too many civil servants, too many people working there, too much. That's costing too much. Too many people deciding on how you live your life. Is that something that you think is even possible? Like, we've just seen this in America, a version of, and the richest man in the world just walked away, and was obviously not going to achieve anything anyway. I don't expect the size of the UK government to get any smaller, but I'd even take 1% smaller, not 1% bigger.
I didn't mention it because I've been banging on about it in my own head for so long. I've taken it as a fait accompli now. We absolutely do need to shrink the size. I think shrinking headcount's really important. And when you try and do that in government, they'll go, no, we'll find savings in other ways, because they know having more people means they can do more bad stuff. And so actually, I think headcount, even if it's expensive to sort of pay people off, is going to be worth it in the long run, because then you've not got a kind of overworked special advisor go around trying to stop all the mad projects that are happening everywhere. One of the things that I think that Musk had to deal with Doge and all the rest of it, is that all the senators and the congressmen and the governors had the pork that they liked from the bad spending, because that's, I guess, the downside of that federal system, and therefore couldn't touch this waste of money here because Senator so-and-so was going to be up for re-election and so on. If you have a plan for all this stuff and do it really early on in the parliament, everyone's hands are dipped in that blood early on. The way that our constitution means you can just cut a lot of that spending much more quickly. I think the economic reality will also force us to reduce headcount and spending and that kind of stuff. And I think crucially, when it comes again to that welfare bill, that's how you can massively cut the size of the state. There's stuff you can't touch in there, like pensions, that's trickier and all the rest of it, that you can make more efficient. But cutting away a lot of these people, astonishing amounts, I think we'll find, where people are being paid who shouldn't be, just to sit around and do nothing but bring in family members and all the rest of it.
What about reducing the workforce? Does that ever get talked about inside government?
Oh yeah, I mean, Boris tried to push this for a while, and you'd ask the civil servants, and they would come up the kind of classic bleeding stump strategy of like, well, I suppose we could manage 4%, but you've said 20%, and how many we're going to calculate how many children die when that happens, and how many farms will just suddenly explode, and how many this, that, and the other, and they'll really lay it on thick. Whereas I don't believe that happens at all. But what you do need to have is an understanding that where some of the kind of welfareists teach, whether it's business or people or whatever else has been done, there is short-term pain and dislocation, and then things get much better. So I think New Zealand has this in their agricultural sector where all the subsidies were taken away and everything collapsed very briefly. And now you get New Zealand lamb everywhere. It's a major export because they learned to be market leading and all the rest of it. And so you've got to have a level of comfortableness with that sort of creative destruction that, again, the sort of free marketeers talk about. And that's scary. But I suspect we have to use the crisis of how bad the economy is going to be to get to that point. And what Thatcherism showed us is that you can turn this stuff around so quickly. Just a bit of economic freedom can cause absolute miracles. And I'll end with this, that the criticisms of Thatcher in those first few years were, God, the economy is so bad and unemployment's so high, it's so terrible, she doesn't know what she's doing. A few years later, it was the Harry Enfield sketch. Loads of money, where they know the price of everything and the value of nothing, and all they care about is being filthy rich and all the rest of it, because suddenly everything turned around like that. And that's what a little bit of economic freedom can do. It did in the past, it can do so again. And then we can start affording all this other stuff as well, because the problem of no growth means it does become zero-sum, and then we get mean about things. If you can get people onto that prosperity agenda, then wonderful things can flow from it. But if you don't, nothing can.
Bravo. Well, let's keep our fingers crossed. I think that sounds like a lovely future. I'm not sure I can see it at the moment, but who knows? Anyway, James, thanks for coming in, mate.
Thanks,
really,
mate.
really enjoyed speaking to you. Wonderful.
Likewise,
orator.
thank you.
Thank you.